It's hard to believe Margaret has been gone for almost 30 years.
I'm sorry, you must be thinking of someone else. David's Aunt Margaret,
She passed in 1996, sweetheart.
The first time I realized my husband had been lying to me for 12 years, he wasn't standing in front of me. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't even in the room. He was 40 minutes away, exactly where he told me he'd be every single Saturday. The person who exposed him was his own mother. She looked me in the eyes at a family funeral and said something so ordinary that no one else in the room reacted. But in that moment, my entire marriage collapsed. She said, "It's hard to believe Margaret has been gone for almost 30 years. I smiled politely. Then I laughed because I thought she'd simply gotten confused. She had to be because every Saturday for the last 12 years, my husband kissed me goodbye, picked up the groceries I'd packed for his elderly Aunt Margaret, and drove 40 minutes to spend the afternoon taking care of her. I'd cooked meals for that woman. I'd sent birthday flowers. I'd signed Christmas cards with her name inside. I'd even cried for her when David came home saying her health was getting worse. There was only one problem. Margaret had died years before I ever met my husband, which meant that for 12 years, my husband hadn't been visiting his aunt. He'd been visiting someone else. And when I finally followed him one Saturday morning, my life split into a before and an after. My name is Rachel Colton, and this is the story of how one sentence at a funeral uncovered an entire second life. My husband had built just 40 minutes from our front door. I met David when we were 17. Neither of us cared much about chemistry class, and honestly, I don't think either of us learned anything about chemistry that year. What I do remember is the way he laughed, the way he made even awkward teenagers feel comfortable. Back then, he was the kind of boy teachers trusted with extra responsibilities because he always seemed older than everyone else. Steady, patient, reliable. Life pulled us in different directions after graduation, college, jobs, different cities, and years passed without either of us speaking. Then, almost 15 years later, we ended up seated at the same table during a mutual friend's wedding reception, and by the end of the evening, those two empty chairs between us might as well have never existed. He told me he'd been married once in his 20s. "It didn't work," he said with a tired smile. "We wanted different things." I didn't ask for details. Everyone has chapters they'd rather leave closed, and I respected that. Looking back now, I wonder how many opportunities the truth had to introduce itself that night and quietly chose not to. 18 months later, we were married in my parents' backyard beneath a canopy of white lights my father insisted on hanging himself. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't perfect. It was ours. Standing there, holding David's hands while everyone we loved smiled back at us, I remember thinking I had found the kind of love people spend their whole lives searching for. Not dramatic, not loud, just dependable, comfortable, safe. If someone had whispered in my ear that afternoon that the man smiling back at me already carried a secret large enough to destroy everything we were building, I would have laughed. Not because I believed David was perfect, but because I believed he was honest. There's a difference. The first few years of our marriage were wonderfully ordinary. David worked for a regional logistics company, and I taught fourth grade at the elementary school 2 towns away. Our weeks settled into routines almost without us noticing. Coffee together before work, phone calls during lunch, takeout on Friday nights whenever neither of us felt like cooking. Every summer we drove to the Gulf Coast, stayed in the same little motel, ate seafood that was far too expensive, and promised ourselves we'd save more money before the next vacation. We never did. We argued about paint colors while renovating the kitchen. He wanted gray, I wanted yellow, and yellow won. For years afterward, he'd tease visitors by saying he'd lost the biggest argument of our marriage to a gallon of paint. He remembered birthdays better than I did. He knew exactly how my coffee tasted. When my mother had surgery, he drove almost an hour to buy the only canned soup she liked because every other store had sold out. Those weren't grand romantic gestures. They were small and consistent, the kind that quietly convince you someone loves you. Everyone adored David, my parents, our neighbors, my coworkers, his family, and if anyone had asked them to describe my husband, they all would have used the same words: kind, dependable, thoughtful. The hardest part about telling this story now is admitting those descriptions weren't entirely wrong. David really was those things. That's what made the lie so difficult to see. About 2 years into our marriage, Saturday afternoons quietly changed. I should probably start checking on Aunt Margaret, David told me one evening while we cleaned up after dinner. My parents don't really speak to her anymore, old family disagreements. I asked if she was all right. She's getting older, he nodded. Living alone now. I don't want her spending weekends by herself. I remember smiling and telling him he should absolutely go. That was the beginning. Every Saturday, the same routine. I'd wake up early, go grocery shopping, pack fresh fruit, soup, bread, sometimes homemade lasagna, sometimes casserole, sometimes cookies, because David always said Margaret loved homemade cookies. He'd kiss my forehead, take the bag, tell me not to wait up if traffic was bad, then disappear for 4 or 5 hours before coming home carrying pharmacy receipts or grocery receipts I'd never thought twice about. Sometimes he'd look tired, sometimes sad, sometimes distracted, and I thought I understood why. I imagined an elderly widow slowly fatting with age and David quietly carrying the burden the rest of his family had abandoned. Honestly, it made me love him even more, once I offered to come with him. I'd love to finally meet Aunt Margaret. He smiled. You will, when she's having a better week. A few months later, I asked again. He hesitated just long enough that I noticed. She's been confused lately. I don't think meeting someone new would help. That sounded reasonable. A year later, I asked again, and he kissed my forehead and said, soon. Always soon. Never today. I never realized that every promise to introduce us was buying him just a little more time. One Christmas, David came home unusually quiet. He barely touched dinner, and he sat staring out the kitchen window long after we'd finished eating. Bad day? I asked. He rubbed his face. Margaret isn't doing very well. I walked over and wrapped my arms around him and told him he didn't have to carry all of this alone. He reached back and squeezed my hand and thanked me. That night I cried for a woman I'd never met, a woman I believed was spending another Christmas slowly dying. Years later, I would discover that while I was grieving for someone who had already been dead for decades, David had most likely been comforting someone else entirely, and I still had absolutely no idea who. I spent the next several days convincing myself there had to be another explanation, because the alternative was too painful to accept. There are some truths your mind refuses to process immediately. It protects you. It gives you time. It whispers that maybe you misunderstood, maybe you heard wrong, maybe there is a simple explanation. That was what I told myself. David was not a liar, not my David, the man who left notes in my lunch bag before work, who sat beside my hospital bed when I had surgery, who held my mother's hand and called her mom long before she ever asked him to. People like that didn't build secret lives. At least that's what I needed to believe. But once doubt enters your mind, even the smallest things start looking different. Memories you once considered ordinary suddenly become evidence, and conversations you forgot suddenly return with a different meaning. I started remembering all the little moments I had ignored, the questions I never asked, the answers I accepted too easily, because when you love someone deeply, you don't look for reasons to doubt them, you look for reasons to trust them. And David had given me 12 years of reasons. The first thing I did was call Carol, his mother, the woman whose single sentence had started this entire nightmare. I waited until David was at work. I remember sitting in my car outside my own house, phone in my hand, staring at her name on the screen for almost 5 minutes, not even knowing what I was going to say. So I started small. Carol, can I ask you something about Aunt Margaret? There was a pause, not a normal pause, not the kind where someone is thinking, but the kind where someone already knows what question is coming. Margaret, she repeated. Yes, I said, David's aunt. Another pause, longer this time. Then she said, Rachel, I think we need to talk. And the way she said my name told me everything. Something was wrong. I drove to Carol's house that afternoon, and the entire way there I kept preparing myself for an explanation. Maybe Margaret had a different name. Maybe David had another relative. Maybe Carol had misunderstood. Anything that would allow me to go home and apologize to my husband for doubting him. But when Carol opened the door, she didn't look surprised to see me. She looked afraid, and that was the moment I knew she wasn't confused or mistaken. She knew exactly why I was there. She whispered for me to come in, and I followed her into the same kitchen where I had sat through countless family dinners, except this time everything felt different, like I was sitting in a room where everyone knew a secret except me. She made coffee neither of us drank. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in my throat for days. Who is Margaret? Carol looked down at her hands and said something I will never forget. Rachel, Margaret was David's aunt. Small wave of relief went through me, but then she continued. She was his aunt. Past tense, not is, was. My stomach tightened. When did she pass away? I asked. Carol closed her eyes, and for several seconds she said nothing. Then quietly, 1996. The room went completely silent because 1996 wasn't 12 years ago. It wasn't even close. David and I hadn't even reconnected in 1996. We were teenagers still living completely separate lives. No, I said. That can't be right. Carol started crying, and that was the moment I stopped looking for an explanation and started looking for the truth. When I got home that evening, David was already in the kitchen preparing dinner, the same kitchen where he had cooked my mother's favorite pot roast, the same kitchen where we had spent thousands of ordinary evenings together. He smiled when he saw me and said, "Hey." One word, normal, comfortable, like nothing had changed. And maybe that was the most disturbing part, because suddenly I was looking at my husband and I didn't know who I was looking at anymore. "David," I finally said, "can I ask you something? Your Aunt Margaret, how long has she been sick?" His expression changed only slightly, but I saw it. A tiny hesitation, a flicker of fear, the kind of reaction you miss when you trust someone completely. The silence that followed was only a few seconds, but it felt like minutes. Then he smiled a small, careful smile and asked why I was asking. And right there, in that moment, I knew. I didn't know the whole truth yet, but I knew I was no longer standing in the marriage I thought I was standing in, because my husband wasn't surprised by the question. He was surprised that I had finally asked it. That night I didn't confront him. I wasn't ready, because anger is easy, but understanding the truth is the part that breaks you. I waited until David fell asleep. Then I sat in the dark living room looking through old photographs of our life together, our wedding, vacations, birthdays, Christmas mornings, 1,000 memories that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I made a decision. I was going to find out where my husband went every Saturday, not because I wanted revenge, but because after 12 years, I needed to know who I had really married. The answer was waiting 40 minutes away. The next Saturday morning felt different, even though nothing about the day had actually changed. The sky was the same, the coffee tasted the same, the quiet hum of our house was the same, but I was different. For 12 years, Saturday had represented something I admired about my husband, his loyalty, his kindness, his willingness to care for someone who needed him. Now Saturday had become the day I searched for the truth, and that was a painful thing to accept, because the person I was investigating was the same person I had once trusted more than anyone in the world. David walked into the kitchen carrying his keys and said he was heading out. I nodded. The grocery bag was sitting on the counter, the same kind of bag I had packed hundreds of times, filled with food for a woman who didn't exist. That thought should have made me angry, but strangely it made me sad, because that bag represented the version of me who had loved without hesitation, the version who believed being a good wife meant supporting the person you loved. I missed her. David walked toward the door, then he turned around and said, "I love you." Those words almost broke me, because for 12 years I had believed them, and now I didn't know what to do with them. "I love you too," I said, and the words came out automatically, and that hurt more than if I had stayed silent, because a part of me still meant them. I waited 5 minutes, then 10, then 15, then I grabbed my keys and followed. I kept my distance. Every turn he made felt like another piece of my old life disappearing. The roads became unfamiliar, the buildings changed, the neighborhoods grew quieter, and eventually he turned onto a street lined with small houses and tall trees. It wasn't the kind of place where someone went to care for a sick elderly woman. It was the kind of neighborhood where families lived, where children played outside, where ordinary lives happened. I watched David slow down, then turn into a driveway, a small blue house, a bicycle lying on the grass, a child's jacket hanging near the front door. My heart started racing because before David even stepped out of his car, I already knew. For a moment he just sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his head lowered slightly, almost like he was preparing himself. Then he opened the door, and before he could even walk to the front steps, the door opened first. A little boy ran outside, no older than 11, and the expression on his face was something I will never forget. It wasn't the excitement of seeing a family friend. It was something deeper, something natural, the kind of happiness children show when the person they love most has finally come home. "Dad!" The word didn't come out loudly. It came out naturally, like he had said it thousands of times before. I felt my entire body go still, because there are moments when your heart understands something before your mind can accept it, and this was one of those moments. David dropped down and hugged him, and the way he hugged that boy told me everything. He wasn't pretending. He wasn't playing a role. He wasn't visiting someone else's child. That was his son. If you're enjoying this story so far, please tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to Scars and Stories. We love to hear from our audience. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, unable to move, unable to cry, unable to even think, because suddenly every unanswered question from the last 12 years had an answer. The Saturday trips, the phone calls, the receipts, the excuses, the missing family photos, the secretive behavior, all of it, except one question remained. Why would a man who claimed to love me hide a child from me? Why would he build an entire second life instead of telling me the truth? I watched through the windshield as a woman stepped onto the porch, probably in her 40s, not sick, not elderly, not someone who needed an aunt's care. She stood watching David and the boy with a familiar expression, the look of someone who belonged in his life. She said something, David laughed, and the sound traveled faintly through the open window. For one painful second, I remembered David laughing in our kitchen, at our wedding, while we painted the yellow walls. The same laugh, the same man. Two different worlds. I drove home. I didn't confront him. People always imagine betrayal comes with shouting, with broken plates, with dramatic scenes, but sometimes the biggest moments in life happen in silence, and sometimes your entire world changes and nobody around you knows. When David came back that evening, he walked through the door carrying the same calm expression. "I hope Margaret was doing okay," I said, and the lie was almost effortless. "Yeah," he replied. "She had a better day." I looked at him, really looked at him, the man who had just hugged his son, the man who had just walked away from another home, the man who was now standing in mine, and I realized David wasn't going to tell me unless I forced the truth into the light. That night I started searching again, but this time I wasn't looking for proof. I was looking for answers. I wanted to know who the woman was, who the boy was, how long this had been happening, and most importantly, whether my entire marriage had been a lie. Using David's car one afternoon because mine was at the mechanic, I reached up to adjust the sun visor, and a folded piece of paper fell into my lap. It was a vehicle registration document addressed to a woman named Louise Bennett, and the address stopped me immediately. It was the Blue House. I searched the name online, and it took less than 5 minutes to find her. She worked part-time at a neighborhood pharmacy, and there was a staff photo on the pharmacy's website. The moment I saw her face, I recognized her as the woman from the porch. She looked completely ordinary, not glamorous, not intimidating, just human, and for some reason that hurt more, because I had imagined that if another woman existed, she would somehow be extraordinary, someone impossible to compete with. Instead, she looked like someone who shopped for groceries after work and worried about paying bills, which raised a more painful question. Did she know about me? Or had she been living inside her own version of the same lie? 3 days later, I drove to the pharmacy and parked across the street, telling myself I only needed to see her, not speak to her. Around 5:30, she walked out, looking exhausted, rubbing the back of her neck as she unlocked her car. And before getting in, she stood for a moment staring into space with an expression that wasn't happiness or excitement, but the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying too much for too long. I never followed her. Something inside me told me this woman wasn't my enemy. I just didn't understand why yet. That evening, instead of confronting David, I called an attorney. It felt surreal, and I almost hung up 3 times before anyone answered. When the receptionist asked how they could help, I heard myself say words I never imagined speaking. "I think my husband has another family." There was a long silence, then she scheduled me for the following morning. The attorney listened without interrupting as I told her everything: the funeral, Margaret, the Blue House, the boy, the woman, the weekly visits. When I finished, she asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Do you know for certain that David divorced his first wife? Have you ever seen the divorce decree?" I shook my head. "No," she nodded slowly. I think that's where we should begin. I left her office with a knot in my stomach, because until that moment I had assumed I was dealing with an affair, a hidden child, a second family, and as devastating as that was, it still fit inside the world I understood. But her question opened another possibility entirely. What if David had never divorced his first wife at all? The answer arrived less than a week later. My attorney called just after lunch and told me she had located the marriage records. "Rachel," she said carefully, "David never divorced Louise Bennett. The marriage is still legally active." I closed my eyes. "So what does that mean?" She paused again. "It means your marriage may never have been legally valid." I don't remember ending the call or driving home. I only remember sitting in my parked car outside our house, looking at the front door David had carried me across after our honeymoon, and suddenly not knowing if I had ever truly been anyone's wife at all. I did confront David that night, or even the next. I wanted him to have one honest chance to tell me everything himself. 3 evenings later, after dinner, I asked him to sit with me at our kitchen table, the same yellow kitchen where we'd celebrated birthdays and planned vacations and talked about growing old together. I slid the marriage record across the table. David looked down, and I watched the color slowly drain from his face. He knew, before he said a single word, I knew he knew. "What is this?" I asked quietly. He said nothing for almost a full minute, the only sound in the room the ticking of the kitchen clock. Finally, without looking at me, he whispered, "I never wanted you to find out like this." It wasn't denial. It wasn't confusion. It was surrender. "So it's true," he nodded once barely. "Yes," I asked who Louise was. "My first wife," he said. "Not ex-wife," I repeated carefully. He shook his head. "No, you told me you divorced." "I know. You lied." "I know. You married me while you were still married to someone else." His shoulders slumped. "Yes." Then I asked the question that had been haunting me since I watched that little boy run across the yard. "Who is Ethan?" For the first time, David looked directly at me, his eyes already full of tears. "My son." "How old?" 11. 11, almost exactly the number of years we'd spent trying and failing to have children together. While I cried after doctor's appointments and wondered what was wrong with my body, David had been spending every Saturday with the son he already had. I asked him why he never told me. He took a long breath. "Because the lie got bigger every year. The first lie was temporary." I told myself I'd explain everything after Louise got better. Got better from what? After Ethan was born, she developed severe postpartum depression. I didn't understand what was happening. I was 25. I was scared. I didn't know how to help her. "So instead you left." "I moved out, but I couldn't leave Ethan, so every weekend I went back." I kept telling myself I'd file the divorce. I kept telling myself I'd tell you the truth next month, after the holidays, after your birthday, after our anniversary. There was always another reason to wait. And then 12 years passed. I stared at him and believed he was telling the truth, which surprised me, because after all the lies I could still recognize when he was finally being honest, and somehow that made everything sadder. The man sitting across from me wasn't a monster, wasn't someone who enjoyed hurting people, wasn't living 2 lives because he found it exciting. He was a deeply frightened man who had spent 12 years feeding one lie after another because he no longer knew how to stop. That explained his choices. It didn't excuse them, not even close. I asked him if he had ever loved me. "Every day," he said instantly. No hesitation. "You loved me while keeping another family?" "Yes." "I don't understand how that's possible." "Neither do I," he admitted. For the first time in 12 years, there were no more lies between us, only truth. And somehow the truth hurt far more than I had imagined, because I finally understood that the love had been real, the marriage had felt real, and the deception had been real too. Those truths didn't cancel each other out. They simply existed together, and that was what made walking away so much harder. The next morning, I drove to Carol's house. She opened the door, looked at my face, and immediately knew why I was there. Without a word, she stepped aside and said, "I've been expecting you." We sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd handed me recipes and laughed about family stories, and neither of us touched the coffee she poured. "I know everything," I said. She nodded slowly. "I figured you would. How long have you known?" "Since the beginning." I felt something inside me sink. "You watched me buy birthday gifts. You watched me pack groceries. You watched me ask about Margaret." "Yes." Her tears began to fall. "And you never told me." "No." Finally, I asked the question that had haunted me since the funeral. "Why?" Carol looked out the window for a long time before answering. When David was 11, his father disappeared. He walked out, no goodbye, no explanation, no phone calls. I raised 3 children by myself. There were nights we didn't know how we'd pay the bills, birthdays he missed, graduations, Christmas mornings my children spent waiting for a man who never came back. David never forgot what that felt like. She looked at me directly. When Ethan was born and Louise became very sick, David panicked and moved out. But every time he looked at his son, he saw himself, and he couldn't abandon Ethan the way his own father had abandoned him. I told him to divorce Louise. I told him to tell you everything before he married you. He kept saying he would. But then he met you, and he loved you, so instead of telling one terrible truth, he told one small lie, then another, until the lies became his entire life. So you helped him, I said. I did. Why? Because I was afraid that if the truth came out, everyone would lose everything, you, Louise, Ethan, my son, my grandson. I convinced myself I was protecting all of you. I was. I asked her one more question. Did Louise know about me? Carol hesitated, then answered. She knew David had remarried, but she never knew your name and never met you. She believed David had legally divorced her. Louise wasn't the other woman helping David deceive me. She had been living inside her own misunderstanding, just like I had, only the shape of it was different. That evening David called, and after several rings I finally answered. Did you talk to my mom? He asked quietly. Yes. Another silence. I'm sorry. I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I know. But I wanted you to hear one thing from me. I never stopped loving you. For a long moment I couldn't answer. Finally I said, I believe you. He began crying quietly. But loving me wasn't enough, he said. No, I answered. It was. That was the last honest thing we said to each other before the lawyers became involved, because once the truth had finally been spoken, there was only one thing left to do, figure out what was left of a marriage that had never legally existed. Living through the legal aftermath was its own kind of grief. There was no divorce process waiting for me, no official ending to something that had been legally recognized, because according to the law there was nothing to end. My attorney explained it gently. The law looks at paperwork, Rachel, but people don't live on paperwork. You built a life together, you shared a home, you shared responsibilities. Those things still matter. I appreciated her saying that, because a piece of paper could say David was never my husband, but the law had not been there when I was sick, had not held my hand when my father died, had not sat beside me during quiet Sunday mornings. I had lived that life, even if the paperwork said otherwise. David never fought me through any of it. After everything, after all the damage, he agreed to everything, almost like he believed he deserved whatever consequences came. One evening I asked him if he had always known this could happen. He nodded. I knew there was a chance everything would collapse, and I still chose not to tell you. That answer stayed with me, because I could understand fear. I could understand a young man overwhelmed and afraid. But what was harder to accept was every choice made in the years afterward, every Saturday morning, every kiss on the forehead, every time he looked me in the eyes and decided the truth could wait. A secret doesn't survive for 12 years because of one bad decision. It survives because someone keeps choosing it. During that time, I met Ethan properly, not from a distance, not as a secret I wasn't supposed to know, but as a person. The first time I sat across from him, I felt sadness rather than anger, because he was also a victim of a story he didn't create, an 11-year-old boy who had spent his entire life believing his family looked one way, only to discover it was far more complicated. One afternoon, he asked me if I was mad at his dad. No, I told him. I was hurt. Because of me? He asked, and my heart broke. No, never because of you. That moment reminded me that secrets don't only hurt the people who discover them, they hurt everyone connected to them. Eventually, Louise and I agreed to meet. I had imagined anger, awkwardness, maybe resentment, but when she walked into that coffee shop, the first thing I noticed was exhaustion, the same exhaustion I had seen from a distance outside the Blue House. Rachel, I'm sorry, she said, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she understood exactly what it felt like to discover someone you trusted had hidden the truth. We sat together for almost 2 hours. When David and I separated, I thought it was temporary, she told me. We were young, we had just had Ethan, and I was struggling badly after his birth, depression, anxiety. I didn't recognize myself anymore, and David didn't know how to handle it. He wasn't a bad person back then. He was scared. I was scared. And instead of two people asking for help, we both just started drowning separately. I asked if she had known about me. Not really. I knew David had moved on. I knew he had a relationship, but I didn't know who you were. He told me he had someone, but he always said he was going to fix everything, that he would make things right. The same promises, I realized, that he had made to me tomorrow, later, soon, a future where everything would finally be honest, except tomorrow never came. When I asked why she never pushed him, she sighed. Because I was tired. After Ethan was born, I spent years trying to hold everything together, and when David started coming every weekend, I hoped that was enough. I told myself Ethan had his father, and maybe that was all that mattered. That sentence stayed with me, because everyone in this story had been accepting pieces instead of the whole truth. David gave me a marriage without honesty. He gave Louise a father without a future. Carol gave everyone protection without truth. And Ethan grew up inside a family built on information he never had. Everyone thought they were protecting someone. Everyone was actually creating a bigger wound. Understanding why David lied didn't erase the fact that he lied. Knowing Louise suffered didn't erase what happened. Knowing Carol was afraid didn't erase the years she kept quiet. A person can be hurting and still hurt others, and both things can be true at once. What no one prepared me for was that I still remembered the good things. The man who drove across town because my mother liked a certain soup. The man who left notes in my lunch bag. The man who held me when I cried after another disappointing doctor's appointment. Those memories didn't disappear because I discovered the truth. They stayed, and that was confusing because I didn't know how to separate the person from the choices he made. Months passed, and slowly life started becoming a new kind of normal. I repainted the kitchen trim that winter, a small thing to anyone else, but to me it meant something, a way of telling myself this is my home now, not ours, mine. I stayed in the house, continued teaching, went to therapy, and learned how to sit with unanswered questions. My therapist told me something I never forgot. The fact that someone misused your trust does not mean your ability to trust was a weakness. That sentence changed something in me, because I realized I didn't need to become a suspicious person to protect myself, only a wiser one. David eventually moved out, not because I hated him, but because I needed space to understand who I was without him. One afternoon, David asked if I would meet him for coffee, and I almost said no, but something made me go. He looked different, older, not physically, but like the weight of his choices had finally caught up with him. I think about what I did every day, he told me. I used to think the worst thing that could happen was losing you. I realize now the worst thing was that I became someone who could lose you. He asked if I forgave him. I don't know, I said honestly. But I want you to understand that forgiving you doesn't mean what happened was okay. It doesn't mean I would make the same choice again, or trust you the way I used to. It means I don't want to spend the rest of my life being angry at you. A small tear formed in his eyes, and for the first time I felt peace, not because everything was fixed, but because I was no longer trapped inside the pain. People often ask me if I regret those 12 years, and for a long time I didn't know how to answer. Saying yes felt like admitting everything was fake, that every good memory was meaningless, that every moment of happiness had been stolen from me. But saying no felt impossible too, because how could I not regret the pain? How could I not regret the years I spent believing a story that was never true? The answer I eventually found was complicated. I regret what happened. I regret the choices David made. I regret the years that were lost because the people closest to me were too afraid to tell the truth. But I do not regret the person I was during those years. I was kind to him. I was supportive. I loved him. I showed up. Those things were never weaknesses, and they are still parts of me that I value today. The betrayal did not make my love foolish. It revealed something about David's choices, not about my worth. For a long time, I wondered if I should have noticed, and people asked me that question too, sometimes directly, sometimes just in the way they looked at me. Didn't you ever suspect anything? I understood why they wondered because from the outside, 12 years seems impossible. But the truth is that people imagine secrets as loud, obvious things, dramatic clues, someone who looks like a liar. Real deception rarely works that way. It survives not because it is flawless, but because it hides inside ordinary moments, a good morning kiss, a familiar routine, a person you love telling you something you have no reason to question. David was not a stranger in my home. He was my husband, and that mattered. Trust is not built on proof, it is built on history, and every day before the truth surfaced, David gave me fresh reasons to believe him. The problem was that he was also protecting the one thing that could have changed everything. And underneath the life we shared, that unspoken truth kept quietly gathering weight, waiting for the day it could no longer be contained. I have also learned that understanding someone does not mean excusing them. When I explain why David made the choices he made, some people assume I am defending him. I am not. I can understand his childhood, his fear, his regret, and still say that he was wrong. Both things can exist together. A person can carry pain from their past and still be responsible for the pain they create in someone else's life. The same is true for Carol. For a long time, I wanted to see her only as the person who helped bury my marriage, and in some ways she did, but eventually I saw something else too. A mother who was afraid of losing her son, afraid of repeating an abandonment she had already lived through once before. Fear made her choose silence, and silence created damage. That does not make her choice right, but it helped me understand it. If there is one thing this experience taught me, it is that secrets are never as private as the people keeping them believe. A secret may begin with one person, but it always reaches further than that. David thought he was protecting Ethan. Carol thought she was protecting David. Louise thought she was protecting stability. And I thought I was simply living inside a happy marriage. In the end, everyone was undone by the same thing, a truth that should have been spoken years earlier. I still think about that first Saturday morning sometimes, the grocery bag, the front door, the kiss on my forehead. For years, that memory represented betrayal. Now it represents something else, a reminder that life can change without warning, that the person standing beside you today may be carrying a story you know nothing about. That does not mean living suspicious of everyone around you. It means remembering that honesty matters more than comfort, more than avoiding a difficult conversation, more than protecting a version of peace that was never real to begin with. Today my life looks nothing like the one I once imagined, and strangely I am grateful for that, not for what happened, because I am not grateful for the pain itself, but because losing the life I thought I had forced me to build one that belongs completely to me. I discovered parts of myself I had ignored for years, a strength I did not know I had, a courage I did not know I needed, and a kind of peace that no longer depends on someone else's honesty. I still believe love is one of the most beautiful things we can experience. I still believe people can change, and I still believe forgiveness is possible. But I also believe love needs a foundation, and that foundation is truth. Love can survive mistakes, difficult seasons, even deep pain. What it cannot survive is a life built entirely on things that were never said. When I look back now, I no longer see myself only as the woman whose husband betrayed her. That is only one chapter of my story. I see myself as the woman who discovered the truth and chose not to let it destroy her, the woman who lost a marriage but found herself, the woman who learned that sometimes the end of one life is only the beginning of another. Thank you for watching.